of course. For those that don't know who you are, do you mind like introducing yourself, just telling us what area of technology you work in?
So I'm John Roberts. I'm currently Director of Product and Engineering at Oak National Academy, which is an independent arm's length body of the Department for Education. We founded that during the pandemic. I previously worked in tech and various different products and startups. We founded that during the pandemic and subsequently became an arm's length body, a little bit like a company owned by the Department for Education, a not-for-profit owned by the Department for Education.
That's fantastic. And from like a business perspective, were you say acquired by the Ministry of Education?
I wouldn't say so. So basically, we were set up as a not-for-profit incubated by the Reach Foundation, which was a charity, actually a multi-academy trust in London, and then transferred, if you like, rather than acquired in a business sense, because it's a not-for-profit, it's charity. There's like obviously lots of things around IP and that sort of thing, but moved over into the Department for Education in September 2022.
And I find that brilliant as well, like it being non-for-profit, it obviously it does shine a mark on what you said earlier about being a public servant, and I will come back to that later. But yes, about the project, obviously Oak, I saw the messages in the lecture, it was kind of like a let's do this sort of thing, really, ballsy type entrepreneurial type stuff. At the time or during development, did you think this is going to be a long-term thing or just like a short-term solution for the pandemic?
Yeah, I said to Matt Hood, who was the co-founder and is now the chief exec there, I'll give you a hand for a couple of weeks, just get it live, and then I might have to go back to doing what I'm doing basically, which was a busy day job on other things. Lo and behold, 4 years later, or nearly 4 years later, I'm still doing it. I've become a public servant almost by accident. But I think what's really cool about it is like it had really good, quick success. It was having an impact in schools during the pandemic, and we didn't want to. And I think there was a big push generally from teachers to not remove the work that we had done, and so we looked for ways in which we could continue to do that, and we're still doing the kind of maximization of public benefit. We've openly licensed a lot of the code and the content that we've created. We're doing a lot now on AI and how we can apply that, and really thinking about how do we maximize the public benefit of public money that is now going into Oak's work.
That's fantastic. And what you basically just said there, it's extremely value-centered of what the user wants. Ultimately, you solved a problem during the pandemic of remote learning. I want to talk more about that as well. There's a lot of discussion in at least the workplace about the benefits of remote working and obviously being in the office. I've heard different arguments, but is there any sort of difference in, say, remote learning for learning?
Yeah, so I think for looking at the use case that we had during the pandemic, schools were, at the start of it at least, and particularly state schools, weren't all equipped to be able to deliver remote learning. Like it is different, and the long form and the kind of the way that teachers would interact with pupils completely changes in that in the way of delivering remote education. And simply we had to deliver content and get it as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. So and I think we would admit, that you can't do something to the highest level of quality like that first 100%. Time round. And particularly when we were just getting content out there and it was being used at scale. We had about 500,000 or 600,000 users on the first day, and that continued to increase to about 1.1 million daily during the peak of the second pandemic. The second lockdown, and I think we iterated the product. In fact, we're on, I think, the 4th version of the product now, partly because the user need changed a lot. And it changed because initially everybody was remote. Schools were all but shut. And then schools started to reopen, or at least were in like bubbles, and some pupils were in and some pupils were off. Some schools were fully closed. And so we needed to then adapt and provide a slightly different product. So like, how do you look at the interface between where you've got some pupils at home and some pupils in the classroom, and make sure that they're at least trying to learn the same content? And then now we're in the situation where actually most pupils are back in school, in classrooms in the UK. And so our resources are getting used much more on the classroom side and less on the remote side. So our focus, I mean, we are still being used a lot, particularly on, for example, if there's a strike day, we can usually see the spikes. If there's a snow day, we can usually see where the snow is. And actually, it was a really interesting lead metric during the pandemic of where there was increases and spikes in COVID. You could almost see that in the data because you'd have spikes, regional spikes.
Oh, fascinating.
But back to your question about like bridging that gap, I think our use case has changed a little bit. I think from a remote work perspective, we've always been a remote first organization because we literally didn't have a workspace when we started this up. That brings its own challenges. Remote learning brings its own challenges. Engagement can be a little bit more tricky. And it's interesting to see, I think, that teachers, we still think that teachers are still the best delivery mechanism. That's not to say that remote learning doesn't have its place, for sure, but teachers are still the best delivery mechanism of education.
Oh, 100%. I'm so glad you said that as well. The thing about teachers is they do more than just teaching now. There's a ton of admin work that goes behind the scenes, be it content generation for slides, that sort of thing, be it quizzes, which kind of brings me a nice segue into what we were talking about earlier. Obviously, I don't know how much you're allowed to disclose about what you showed us in the lecture, but the model you're using for curriculum generation, was it?
So we're generating lessons and trying to basically take the heavy lifting out of building some of that content whilst maintaining the integrity of the planning process, because the planning process is super, super important for teachers. So I know, having been a teacher, if I just take a resource off of the shelf, don't adapt it, and try and deliver it without looking at it, my lessons, well, number one, the pupils are not going to have an effective lesson in terms of learning and outcomes. Number two, there's a good chance that the behaviour is not going to go well as well in the lesson as a result. And it's really, really important that planning process happens. But you're right that teachers are generating lots of content, particularly in the UK. Like, teachers are very proud of creating a lot of their content. And, there's been a push in some multi-academy trusts to like centralising resources and that kind of thing. But what we want to do is find ways using AI to take the heavy lifting out of some of that generation, some of that adaptation. Like I said, we know, even though we have thousands of resources available, teachers adapt them. So how do we make it easier for them to adapt, to help them along and sort of coach them along, co-pilot them, if you like, along the planning process, but take the heavy lifting out of the content generation?
That's fantastic. And I want to go back to something you said earlier that got my ears perked up. So you mentioned about iterating through to the fourth version of your model. Well, not model, but the
product.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Now, obviously, to any entrepreneurs listening that are perhaps new to the game, it can be very tempting from a production point of view to create the perfect final product that you've envisioned. But I want to know, from someone who's actually been in the industry and that has dealt with development, how important is it to iterate alongside user feedback?
I mean, it's critical. I think we launched a product to effectively 500,000 users that was, in most other like commercial scenarios, if you like, effectively a first prototype, and didn't really have that much user testing, was built on like hunches and kind of the experience of everybody that had already built it. So it worked well. Like, it didn't fall over from an architecture point of view, and people engaged with it, and lesson completions were good and all of that kind of thing. So, but as soon as it hits the user, you start to learn things, you get feedback, and it will be used in ways that you definitely don't expect and that none of the team can anticipate. You will find problems and bugs and all of that kind of thing. Like, we rebuilt that product, I think the first time from scratch within 4 months.
Wow.
And then rebuilt it again 12 months later. And I think that there has to be a continuous iteration, a continuous process of improvement, and like acting and reacting to user feedback. We were almost a test case in like launching something so early that there was a risk of it not working, but it worked and it was great. And we did respond really quickly to that user feedback and closing those feedback loops quickly. There's also like at what point, and it's quite hard for decision makers in like entrepreneurs or innovators to know, like, get that balance right. When is it ready? When is it good enough that you can launch it and it's not going to turn a user off? Like, when is it meeting the user need? But also, like, when do you need to refactor or rebuild because you need to be able to go in a slightly different direction? And like, people have talked about this. I mean, there's blogs on like how they refactored or rebuilt Uber from scratch over like a really short period, I think like over a couple of months, and like moved all the users onto that. And we've rebuilt a couple of times, obviously not at the scale of Uber, but it's really it's a really difficult decision to make, but that pain is often never regretted later on. Like, I think rebuilding is actually, and refactoring is a really important process because it allows you to actually, like, you shouldn't build up too much technical debt. You are inevitably, in being too reactive, going to build up some technical debt. And like, as a technology leader, as a product leader, as somebody making those decisions, they are the sorts of decisions that are really difficult, but are also absolutely critical to the success of the organization.
Oh, 100%. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I suppose it makes sense, given your military background, that doing the hard thing is often the right thing, which for a lot of people nowadays, they really want to just stick with the easy way, thinking that's the right way. I 100% like agree with that. Going back to our point about the product that is currently in development, about curriculum generation, I want to know more on your perspective about how AI can help the education industry, and also where the dangers lie. Yeah,
that's a really interesting question. I think at the moment, I mean, there's all the things around quality, safety, bias, and data privacy as well. And we have approached this right now from like making sure that there is a human in the loop, like keeping that teacher in the loop. And I think that's really important because for lots of different reasons. So actually, I'm going to break it down slightly differently. You know, we have applications or applied AI for teachers. We have applied AI for pupils. And I think the quality of where we've got to, if we're even questioning that the quality is not good enough for teachers yet, then we should be really cautious about giving it directly to pupils. And at the moment, we're still testing about how to ensure pedagogical quality with teachers. And like, that's aside from like the privacy and the safety elements of all of this, because they are really legitimate and pupils are interacting with AI in other ways, whether it's, you know, other social media or bots, etc. That's already happening. But like, from an education perspective, like, we're really thinking about how do you ensure like pedagogical, like the educational value, the learning value of what is being created. And perhaps, like, let's say you're building a quiz or you're building some lesson content, like, is it pedagogically and educationally sound in what it produces? The human in the loop is really important there, and the teacher being able to edit, being able to criticize, being able to change, being able to do all of the things and like actually assess whether the model is bringing bias out and edit it in line to make it appropriate for the pupils. And it's really interesting, like the experiments we've done, you get different effects depending on the subject area that you're looking at. For example, that tend to get better effects in Key Stage 3 or in English generally. I mean, that might sound very obvious that LLMs are better at English than or rather the subject of English. It knows the context of a verb really well, for example, compared to, say, generating maths content, where it's sort of guessing a little bit more about the equations or the application of like the computation of like calculating equations or calculating practice examples, etc. So I think if we are questioning that, we need to be really careful about the applications of that in the classroom directly to pupils. And I know that, there are lots of really interesting models and lots of people thinking about the quality and safety side. We should definitely keep the human in the loop. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't use AI in the classroom, or say use AI to generate exemplar, texts, that kind of thing, like to use to analyze, for example, like which one do you think is better, like give that to the pupils. I'm still a little cautious on like content generation direct to pupils. I think the quality is not there yet.
I'm very glad you said that, because I have a follow-up question about the model that was used in the deployment. But human in the loop, that's such a good phrase, because ultimately AI should not be able to, or should not be built with the intention of replacing anyone and the value that they create. It should, in fact, empower the people. It's a tool at the end of the day. But on that note, with regards to human in the loop, because it is good that teachers are owning the stuff that is being built by the curriculum generator, and as well as taking proud ownership of it, editing it to their own liking, so that the teacher is familiar with the content and there's no like wrong information that's passed through. I suppose that's the danger with, because it was a GPT OpenAI model that was used for the curriculum generator. Now, of course, I don't know the statistics myself, but I have heard that it can be inaccurate in producing results. Is there any sort of way in the future you hope to, let's say, get around or overcome that?
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways you could approach that question, and it's a very complex one. Like, we use GPT-4. There is the hallucination rate just on like simple summarization of text has dropped from, I think, 4.5% to 3%, with the shift from GPT 3.5 to 4. So that's on a particular task of like text summarization. When it becomes more complex, then the hallucination or the like inaccuracy rate, if you like, may increase. But there's lots of techniques you can do to try and reduce or mitigate some of that. And it really also depends on the application of that. So if you're trying to build lesson content, then the stakes are a bit higher, and it's important to have that human in the loop. If you're trying to do marking, particularly if it's like formative assessment, the stakes are really high, and it's got to be super, super accurate. Now, we're using we're not looking at marking at the moment. We're looking at like content generation and pedagogical value, and there are various different techniques you can do. So vanilla ChatGPT is like quite good at it, but for example, if you want to generate questions, you can only go so far, like multiple choice questions. You can only go so far with the like quality of the distractors and the prompt engineering techniques, and particularly if you want to do something that's really UK specific. Like I've given examples in the past around like the difference between UK and US music notation, and it actually has a really hard time like using UK music notation for music lessons. Key stage 4 or like more like science lessons for older pupils is another challenge. You need to really rely on the vocabulary. You also actually, if you want to get really good lesson content, ChatGPT is largely doing it in isolation. Like, so if you say to it, I want a lesson on the fall of the Roman Empire, right? It's just building that lesson in isolation. But that lesson falls. I mean, when pupils do that, it's probably going to be, key stage 3, somewhere around year 9 or year 7, year 8, year 9.
Yeah.
Pupils will have already had basically a number of years of education, perhaps a couple of years of like specific history lessons, maybe in like in key stage 2, and so we'll already have learned and have some prior learning. It's really important, therefore, that you're feeding in the curriculum content that may have come before and the most appropriate curriculum content that comes before, so that there is like a foundation to that content generation that is going to make it more accurate and more relevant. So there are two main techniques. There are retrieval augmented generation, and that's where like Oak's content of it being openly licensed and available, and us being able to create the embeddings for that, and actually others being able to do that too, helps us say, okay, what is the most relevant content when you're generating a lesson about the fall of the Romans, and look at the curriculum content, the facts, the misconceptions that like have led up to that pupil knowing or getting to that lesson. Then there's the like prompt engineering techniques as well, which like we have a learning framework or a way of building a lesson at Oak, and we think, you know, that's grounded in research, grounded in learning science, and we have applied the prompt engineering techniques to like basically constrain the model to deliver something that's specific and that we think should be high quality. And so you're basically trying to reduce, although there'll always be an element of hallucination. That's kind of, you know, the models have got good. Like the hallucination actually referred to like when the models were like a lot less accurate actually, and like would, you know, you asked it for something, it would, you know, you ask it for something on the fall of the Romans and it ended up just like thinking about psychedelics, for example, and it genuinely nonsense. Just like it actually hallucinated, whereas now it's just making like smaller mistakes. And so I think now we're getting closer and closer. It will still make mistakes, it still doesn't get everything right, but you can, I hesitate to say the word tune, but you can constrain it to do much more what you want through advanced prompt engineering techniques, of which retrieval augmented generation is one. There is also fine tuning that you could do if you wanted to, but I think at the moment those two techniques appear to have better effects than trying to fine tune something off the shelf. That may change over time. Like one of the more open source models against GPT-4, that may change, and we'll continue to assess that. And there's obviously like interesting developments coming with Gemini and other models. Absolutely.
And it's fascinating. I mean, the technology is only going to improve with time. The hallucination rate is going to drop, and this will hopefully, obviously, I don't think it'll ever reach a point where it's perfect, but it'll be acceptable, like completely acceptable. And we would feel safer using such models in education because there's such a small slip-up rate. Which kind of brings me to the next question, which this isn't an exhaustive approach that I've taken, but in trying to get a gauge of what people think about ChatGPT and data transparency, some people have described it as like a black box as such. Put a prompt into this mysterious black box, and then information comes back out. With respect to the products that you're building surrounding these models, how important do you think data transparency is in this process?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I just want to draw like in your lead up to the question is a really important point there about like getting it to perfection. Like humans aren't perfect.
Yes,
either.
That's very true.
And like the beauty of intelligence is that it can create artworks, or it can create variants, and it can create opinions that are valid and important. And we shouldn't assume that there is a perfect output, because that variance in intelligence is it's basically what intelligence is. So like we need to be really careful about making the assumption that, I think like the models become accurate, but what is perfect? There isn't like the perfect is really, really difficult. Anyway, I just wanted to draw that because I think it's really important. And even still, like,
no, that's absolutely fine.
You might not be. I saw a study this morning where humans could look at AI generated images and human paintings or human artwork, and couldn't necessarily tell the difference, but always ultimately liked the human artwork more. So they couldn't identify to always identify the artwork was AI, but liked the human artwork more. So there's still something in there that gives that like level of I don't know, I'm just going to use the word perfection, but that displays the creativity that we need to be careful not to lose.
Interesting.
But I need to go back to your question. Your question was,
to be perfectly honest, I've forgotten it as well. No, I find your answer to my previous point, that's far more fascinating, because you are right. There are, and it goes back to what I said earlier about how AI can't replace certain things. For teachers, that is the teacher-student engagement and the relationship that's formed there. Same with therapy. The therapist and the therapeutic engagement that's built there, these are the things that you just can't with ones and zeros replace, or at least not with a lot of smoke and mirrors anyway. I want to actually move more towards you as a character, because I find that quite interesting, and I want to talk more about where you were, say, 20 years old, someone in university, what challenges you were facing, and honestly, where were you going? And looking back on how far you've come with all the impressive stuff you've built, what would you do differently if you were there, or if you would do anything differently?
Gosh, I mean, this is a really interesting question for me, because if at age 20 or even earlier, like age 18, you'd said this is what I would be doing, I would be shocked, surprised, and I think you can't predict where things are going to go, and that's okay. Like, uncertainty is okay in all of that, and give yourself the best foundation to deal with that uncertainty. So from my perspective, like, I passed Royal Marines officer selection age 17, so just started sixth form college. 9/11 had just happened after I passed selection, so it was a very active time, should we say? Or increasingly active time, and obviously the last 20 years that's changed significantly, and we know we're in a slightly different political, military, global environment now, right? And I went to university as basically funded by the Royal Marines to do physics at Sheffield. And got injured in my second year a couple of times, to the extent that it basically meant that I had to withdraw from the Royal Marines. They gave me some time to get better. I recovered, but the rules are the rules, and the military is very rule-based.
My brother knows.
And that's sometimes how it goes. Ironically, it wouldn't be a bar these days. And I've done a lot of climbing, running, triathlon, all sorts of things, and sort of overcome those. But what it meant was that career that I had set up for myself, and had passed a really tough selection process, and even tougher to get the funding, was then removed. And so I went from knowing what my job and my career was going to be, and I'm 39 now, and I suspect I would have probably only left. I mean, the plan would have been to have only just about left the Royal Marines about a year ago, which would have meant I'd served in nearly 20 years. But the reality is, I left university 2005, I think, if I remember correct. It feels like a long time ago now.
When I was free.
2005. And didn't have a job at that point, having been well set up for one and knowing exactly what I was going to do. So, I was a climber. I set myself, I was an entrepreneurial, I think, rather than an entrepreneur at that point. And thought, how can I apply myself? I need to make some money. Did some set up a business building climbing walls and doing that kind of thing. And we built all sorts of climbing walls all over the world. Actually, ended up flying to Falkland Islands and Sicily and all sorts of stuff.
Oh wow!
And that provided a gateway for then me thinking about, it wasn't fulfilling enough basically, and it was great fun traveling all over the place, but I wanted to find something that I think had a element of public service that that was perhaps similar to the Royal Marines, and ended up doing Teach First and teaching in a really challenging school in Manchester. And I'd learned to code throughout or C++ actually, throughout my degree, and could see that some of the solutions to the challenges in that school relied on basically trying to digitize some of the processes. It was really basic in terms of like taking a paper process and digitizing it and just essentially closing a feedback loop to make reporting on behavior incidents much quicker and much easier to action. And behavior in schools is challenging if it's not followed up, or it doesn't get better. It's certainly not going to get better if it's not followed up. So, we used to have this situation where it was logged on paper, and it took, 2 days for the head of year or whatever to acknowledge or action what had happened or have a conversation with the pupil, which candidly, by the time the pupil had been followed up with, had forgotten what they'd done. And so we made that feedback loop really quick, and it had a positive impact in the school. And I thought, you know what, this is like, I know now that I started to build up a level of confidence. And I think that is really important, that you have to have a level of belief and confidence that you can deliver something that users want. And did that, and then we got some funding for that, and then actually I left that and gave it over to the other co-founder, and then started a new thing, which was providing legal services to teachers through a digital product as well, and that really worked effectively. And we were it was in the kind of the space around policy, tech, and education and legal, and in the kind of the center of the Venn diagram of all of that. And that worked really well. And we've provided a really great resource to teachers up and down the UK. We have teachers in about 2,500 schools. And then have worked on various different tech projects that have all largely been social impact or social enterprise. Now, that doesn't mean that they absolutely have to be not-for-profit. I think you can be a socially impactful for-profit making business if you hold the right values and you hold principles. And I think it's really, I've often had conversations with other founders and friends who have become founders or about how to set up their business, and they've said, I need to do it as a not-for-profit, it's for education, we shouldn't be selling to schools or whatever, and sort of suggested that they look at alternative models because it would help them to scale and to increase their impact. But that's not always appropriate, and sometimes a not-for-profit charitable model is as well. So I've done a mixture of the two, but always with a social impact focus.
It's fascinating because I've identified two things about your character that I could probably pin down to why you've reached the success you've reached. First of all is faith, be it in yourself or the general uncertainty of where things are headed, which is what you mentioned earlier. And secondly, which I think underpins every kind of job role that you've had, be it Royal Marine, be it teacher, be it entrepreneur, public servant, you live a life of service. And I think that's incredibly noble. And it brings me to, depending on if we've got enough time, to my last question as, what motivates you? What's your why?
Well, I mean, thanks for that, Archie. And I think we shouldn't shy away from that if it is confidence in your ability, or it's more about resilience. Don't get me wrong, I was devastated when I couldn't join the Marines, or couldn't follow that up, and it's a faith that things will be okay in the long run.
Even if it feels terrible
even if it's terrible in the time. It's almost like a grief process, right? You will get over it in time, and there are ways to get over it, and you will. But there's a resilience there, and there's a belief that you can do it, and holding on to that is really important. And often, you're right. The easiest path is not always the right path to success. Sometimes. What's my why? I mean, there's a few different things. I just really like building things. I really like building things. I like seeing the impact of that in that kind of, again, Venn diagram between education and impact and technology, and getting things and getting benefit to users in that space. And I really enjoy seeing how can you improve something? How can you make somebody's life easier through technology? And so like I think that is like every day at the moment, like we are trying to build things that make teachers' lives easier, and whether that's with businesses that I've previously set up or things that I've invested in or supported, or what I'm doing now, all of them are about how, or almost all of them are about how can we basically make people's lives easier.
That's so noble.
And I think and there is, it's got to be grounded in research. It's got to be grounded in doing it responsibly, and various different like models. And you can make money in that process as well. Like that's not to say everything should be charitable, like I said, and not for profit. But I think, and I think even that comes through to work. Like I like building things. I also like doing the strategic end and seeing where things are going. But sometimes I actually really like getting involved in like just helping the team fix things and being in the detail, and just like trying to, in the classic, like how can I remove some blockers? Like I constantly think about how can I remove blockers in my team to basically just enable them to be able to get on with things.
Even you could argue that's service in itself, isn't it? You're looking to improve a situation. The reason why I bring up service as a principle is because, and there's a fantastic book I recommend anyone read. It's called High Performance Habits by Brendan Burchard. And he basically does the gist of interviewing successful people and condensing their habits into something that people can follow in the book. And the number one thing is service. Service is for all high performers at the heart of everything they do. And high performers can come in any different format, be it a mum that sacrifices anything for their children to get a better education, or in your case, someone who dedicates their life to service in the sense of, be it in the big sense, such as Oak National Academy, non-profitable organisation that help people with remote learning through the pandemic, or even on a micro level with your team trying to fix solutions. So I just had to mention that because it's like blaringly obvious to me, like that is your modus operandum. Which I think this should be my last point before we sign off, and I think we've kind of reached the half-hour point. If you had to impart any sort of advice to any of our listeners, what would that bit of advice be?
Oh gosh, I might need half an hour to think about this. I think with the context that your work, like that this podcast is for, and I think the resilient and the unknown is like particularly with technology and AI, we are in a revolution. Things will change, and being okay with that change and knowing that things will be okay, like things will be okay in the long run, and being resilient to that. And like, actually, yes, it can be hard at times, and you'll think, how on earth are we going to do this? But a resilience and like try and find your own why, if you like, but being resilient to that change and thinking that you will be okay. And I promise, like, things will be okay in the long run. And I think just thinking about like what your principles and values are. Like for some people, I mean, I will say I have friends that went into banking and retired at my age, and I'm not always convinced. They actually reflect and say, I wish I'd done it the other way around.
Interesting.
Or like, I'm not the happiest. And I don't think it's always like, I have to be really clear. Like, you're about to go into the economy, finish a degree, perhaps actually finish second degree and go into the economy. And I think like having a values and principles based approach to what you're doing is really, really important. And just like think about and understand what they are. It's really difficult. It will take time to like understand what they are. But if you are aware of those, it really helps you to make the right decisions about where you go, what you work on, and like and actually be resilient around change.
Brilliant. That fantastic piece of advice, honestly, but that very much resonates. I can understand that would resonate for a lot of listeners as well. Yeah, that's pretty much it for the interview. I mean, is there anything you want to tell the camera, the people listening at home, where they can find your socials, what work you're doing?
Oh gosh. You can go to the National Academy. Hopefully we'll be launching the AI products soon for public use. They're still in limited testing. It's the National Academy. My socials, crikey. You can mainly find. I tend not to use them, Twitter and so on these days. But if you find me on John Robeds, JohnRobeds, and LinkedIn, feel free to contact me on there.
Fantastic. And thank you very much for listening as well. Next week we're going to be interviewing Phil Harvey, fantastic guest that we're very much excited to interview. Tune in next time. Thank you very much for listening.